So I'm really glad that you all are here. And we have Maeve Reston and Juana Summers. Maeve is from CNN, who we work together very closely. And Juana's from Mashable, which I did used to work at Mashable, so you've got some fans in the crowd. So we're basically just going to have a really lively discussion about politics and covering 2016 in the digital age. We obviously have all of these platforms that are circling around us all the time. How do we get to our audiences? How do we engage them? Do we compete? How fast are we? What are the campaigns doing? Who's successful? Where are they successful? So I am going to kick it off with just a little intro about myself. My name is Ashley Codiani. I am the Director of Social Publishing for CNN. Previous to this role, I was with CNN Politics, doing a lot of the social media coverage of the campaign in 2016, using things like Snapchat and Vine and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to engage our audiences. And we have Maeve Reston here, who will give us a little short bio about herself.
I am probably I've taken like one of the most old school tracks to where I am, right? I worked at the LA Times for 8 years before coming over to CNN. So now doing kind of a hybrid role of TV and digital video, and also still writing as much as I did at the LA Times. Juana and I were actually on the campaign trail together in 2012 when she was with Politico. This is my 4th presidential campaign, so I've sort of seen the social media side of it evolve in all the different iterations, and it's very different this year in the age of Trump, which I'm sure we will talk about. So yeah, and Juana?
Hi, I'm Juana Summers, and I'm the politics editor at Mashable, which means I direct all of our coverage of the 2016 presidential race, and I'm also hiring a team to cover that along with us, so make sure you check that out, a little shameless plug there. Prior to joining Mashable, I covered Congress at NPR for our national headquarters in Washington, D.C., and as Maeve said, I covered the 2012 presidential race for Politico. This is my 2nd presidential cycle, and even in 4 short years, it's just so impressive and interesting to me how much the social environment has changed, not just from the tools that we use to report into our jobs on a day-to-day basis, but for how the campaigns are really leveraging it to get their messaging out and to circumvent the traditional press. And as Maeve said, if Donald Trump has shown us anything, that is certainly the case with him.
Yeah, right. So before we get into the nitty-gritty about how much Donald Trump is tweeting and what animals Ben Carson is throwing up on his Facebook page, let's first get to know you guys a little bit. So you're constantly on the road and constantly on planes. So tell me, what's the one thing that you could not be doing in 2016 without? What do you always bring with you?
That's a great question. I probably would not be able to survive without spare batteries. I have one of those massive portable battery banks that recharges everything from my laptop to my phone and whatnot. Although I think my new favorite thing is I actually just, at the suggestion of someone else, just bought my first pair of noise-canceling headphones, and considering that I'm getting on a plane at 10 o'clock tonight to fly back across the country, I think those are going to be my new favorite toy for all of the travel that I do back and forth this cycle.
So I lose everything. So I actually, through the course of these different campaigns, have learned that I have to label everything with a P-touch before I leave the house. Kind of like old school, the way you would go to camp. But I always travel with a backup tape recorder because I have 2 iPhones, but I don't ever trust the recording feature on it. And many times I have had kind campaign staffers pick up my tape recorder for me that I left in Vegas and send it along in the plane to South Carolina so it gets to me in New Hampshire. So labeling is the key thing. And I do also, I'm kind of obsessed with, all those different like scuba organizational tools where you can do all your cords, obsessed with gear ties. And I often clip things to myself so that on the road, like while running around on the rope line after the candidates, you can, still hang on to everything.
You have like a little tool belt of all of
your
tools.
Yeah, exactly. I totally need a tool belt. So.
Which is indicative of how reporting and journalism has changed in the last 10 years, right? You know, now you need to clip all of these social tools to yourself so that you don't lose them.
Right.
Okay, so it's a very dynamic campaign. There are a lot of candidates. What are you guys seeing the most on the trail? You know, what is happening so far in this race?
I think the most fascinating thing about this cycle so far is you obviously have an incredibly skilled candidate in Donald Trump
Right.
from the perspective of social media. And, you know, we saw with Hillary Clinton in past campaigns, or even, you know, Scott Walker, a lot of those candidates would always like sign their tweets, you know,
Right.
SW, right, or HRC. And Trump is so interactive on social media and on Twitter in particular that I think voters really are feeling a connection to him. And the interesting thing from our side of it is, you know, it just kind of feels like a campaign on crack this time. Like
Right.
you know, I was writing a Trump story around the time that Jeb Bush went to the border. And literally because of Donald Trump's tweets, it was almost like the story had changed 4 times throughout the day. So,
Right.
you know, in a couple of cycles ago in 2004, you would go in with your angle or your analysis piece that you were writing for the weekend. And you just can't do that anymore. It's you know, it's so quick and so driven in many ways by how clever the campaigns are in their use of social media. So I think that's been really interesting.
How are you feeling about it? Do you sort of feel the same way?
I absolutely agree, and I think another candidate we've seen really own that space has been Carson. If you watch his Facebook page, he's
Right.
regularly, you know, going on there and taking questions from people and just talking back and having this very authentic conversation with him. And here's another guy like Donald Trump and like Carly Fiorina. He's not a politician. He's not following the traditional campaign playbook that we saw used in past campaign cycles, and yet he's really endearing himself to the voters. The thing I'm really watching for, though, is while the social has been very fascinating, I want to see, once we get to the general election, how this translates and how they're using the data that we're getting from these
Right.
social moments and what that bleeds into. I'm assuming we're going to see a very, very competitive general election,
Right.
and data is going to play a huge part in that and determining who wins and who loses.
Because the Republicans insist now that they certainly have, you know, caught up with the pioneering technology that the Obama campaign used.
Right.
That was sort of tested in the 2014 cycle, but we haven't seen it roll out in a presidential, so it's really an interesting thing to watch.
Right. And it'll be interesting to see if all of these likes, clicks, engagements actually translate into votes, which will be, you know, sort of to what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the key. You hear people talk about, sure, every time Donald Trump tweets something eyebrow raising, he gets a ton of likes and tweets and retweets and things like that. But can you actually take the people who engage online and actually mobilize them out to the polls is, I think, a
Right.
very fair question. And that's what a lot of Republican strategists tell me when they're saying, when I'm talking about, you know, well, Donald Trump's really popular online. We're seeing all of this sentiment around him and engagement. And they're just like, yeah, that's great, but that's online. If they don't actually show up and sign the petitions to get on ballots, if they don't actually show up at the polls in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, then does it actually mean anything?
And
Right.
I think that that's what all of these other, you know, candidates are holding out hope for, is that while some of these candidates, like Trump, may have engaged more people online, it's very hard to get someone to show up at a caucus in Iowa,
Right.
or to do kind of the spade work that you need to do in South Carolina. And I also think it's just so interesting because we know from the data that media coverage drives how popular a candidate
Right.
is in the polls. So it's a little unclear. The picture's a little cloudy because Trump has gotten so much coverage, including from CNN and
All of us.
Mashable, and we're
Right.
totally guilty in that front. But I think that it's been really hard to see how people are actually doing in the polls. I don't trust any of the polls right now. So that's where social is often a better measure in terms of mentions and
Right.
what people are talking about when it comes to Carly Fiorina or the different candidates.
Right. Well, it's where the conversation is. So to lead into that, you guys met in 2012. You talked about it a little bit. I want you to tell me, in this digital age, how this election is different for you and in covering it. I can only imagine. How has the reporting changed?
2012. I mean, I think, I hope that, you know, at the most basic level, really, that the reporting doesn't change, you know, that your standards for what you what you report and what you tweet really should always be something that is based in fact. And I mean, that world has gotten a lot murkier. Like, what does it mean as a reporter to retweet someone? Or, do people get confused about what your opinions are based on who you like on Facebook? So that's been a really tricky, interesting world to navigate. But I do think, back in 2012, it was still just kind of like a blog cycle, right? Like the plane would take off, you had 30 minutes in the air, you could write something quickly, file when you land, and now, it's all, the news is happening every second.
I have to say I agree with that. I think the fundamentals are really the same. The differences in the tools that we use and in the ways that we put out the news, I don't think we were talking about Vine as much or as Periscope as much. And I remember back in 2008, we weren't really talking about Twitter in the way that it's so much of our lifeblood now. So the fundamentals of reporting are still there, and I think the judgments are the same, and the decisions that we weigh on a day-to-day basis as to what we cover. It's just the mediums, the tools, and we're adapting to the way that people communicate, and that's what you have to do to be relevant and to be successful.
I will say that it has, this campaign, I think that the dynamic between reporters and campaign aides, and particularly going back to 2008, has completely changed. In 2012, the Romney campaign, which we both covered, they used to talk about Twitter as being their early warning system. When you're a reporter, one of the worst things is sort of being like locked in a campaign bus when you get into the Secret Service bubble, because you are screened, you're with the candidate, you have to stay in that bubble, you can't leave to do anything, which sounds crazy. And by the way, news organizations do pay for their travel, their food, everything. But so I remember we had a situation one night where literally the bus was just left on the tarmac with all the reporters in it with no driver, and just stayed on the tarmac for 3 hours. And often you were sitting in a bus for a long period of time. But in this case, nobody could really figure out what was going on. So reporters started tweeting, and it started this like crisis mode, in Romney headquarters, where they got the buses moving, et cetera. So I think that campaign aides certainly use social media more to kind of police reporters and try to control the message, and that's been an interesting dynamic that's evolved and continues to evolve.
I think it also has really ratcheted up the level of competition between and among reporters. I remember in 2012 being on the phone literally screaming at people at the headquarters of my former employer because they were going to run an aggregator report from another news organization of something that was reportedly said on a conference call. And it's just like, I want to shake people. You guys, I was on the same call. That is not what the candidate said. It's not accurate. And it was something very eyebrow raising that I believe Paul Ryan, who I covered in 2012, had said. And it was just like, this isn't right. But when something gets out there into the ecosystem, there's this constant pressure that you have to inject yourself in the cycle. You have to be there. You have to have that information first and fast. And when you're the person on the ground or in that campaign bus or at the rally, it can be hugely maddening, frankly.
Right.
Because that's important, where like the fact checking comes in, and where you have to kind of pull the conversation back and make sure that no one's making errors just because something's gone out on Twitter too quickly. I would, always rather be right than first.
Yep.
And that sort of happened when Ted Cruz had announced his campaign. Those who were watching it on social and TV saw his back towards the camera. He, and everyone started tweeting, Ted Cruz turns his back on his campaign, et cetera, et cetera. But those who were in the room had the context to know that it was a circle arena, and it wasn't that he was deliberately turning backs on anyone. He just had a circular stage. And so I agree that the challenges in context from being on the road and then seeing things percolate on social.
And particularly, campaigns just get obsessed with crowd counts, which are impossible. It is so hard to figure out how many people are at an actual event. You can figure out how many chairs are in the room. You can figure out what the capacity is. You can talk to the fire marshal, which you always should do as a reporter, but often the fire marshal has, a horse in the game and wants to help the candidate, and so they inflate the crowd count. And so it's one of those things where, a picture goes out on Twitter of a half-empty room, and a campaign thinks that that's a crisis. So.
We did talk a little bit about this with your tool belt and all the things you're doing on the trail. So tell me about your day-to-day. There's this mystique about campaign reporters, and they're just as busy as the candidate. But really give us an idea of, what it's like for you to be in Iowa for a day, or New Hampshire, and how you maneuver that.
New Hampshire is amazing because you can often hit like 3 or 4 candidate events in the same day.
Right.
Depending on whether you have someone to drive while you write and things like that. Iowa is, obviously it's these huge open stretches of road. I discovered very quickly about the satellite speeding tickets, which are like the white stripes on the road. So the days are really long. For example, in the recent CNN debate, it started at 2 a.m. each morning out here in Simi Valley, did debate coverage all day, and then in the evening would be, the night of the debate, writing the analysis piece. So you kind of sneak in naps when you can. But there's so much adrenaline racing through your system, particularly in New Hampshire at these small events where you're meeting voters and that it kind of keeps you going through the day. That's why you kind of always have to travel with like nuts or beef jerky or something because there just doesn't end up being time for food a lot of times. And then there's other stretches where it's just, especially the most horrible part of covering a candidate there are when you're stuck on the plane is that there's just stretches of dead time, and you can use that time to write and report, but a lot of times you're in the bubble with 40 other reporters and you can't report the full story that you want to when you're sitting in a 3-seat row, which Juana and I often were next to each other.
No, it's been really refreshing, frankly, after the end of the 2012 cycle of being on the plane and in this sort of bubble where your movements are controlled, you don't have a lot of freedom. I just spent some time in Iowa for a feature I was working on Bernie Sanders to just have the time I got to his first rally in Grinnell, Iowa, 2.5 hours early, and to have the time to sit there and kind of soak in the scene and to talk to people and have those conversations instead of being frantic and terrified that if I don't leave after this event right immediately now, I'm going to miss the next thing that is another 2.5 hours away, and it's going to throw my entire day off. So I actually really love this part of the campaign cycle because you have that freedom to tell the deeper, more meaningful stories as opposed to, I feel like at the end of 2012, you'd be in 5 states a day and you've heard the same speech and tweeted out the same quotes 5 different times with just a different state's flag in the background.
And I think that certainly the digital world is driving a new and different and unique kind of coverage. That's why I came to CNN, was because I was going to get to work with, an amazing producer and photojournalist, Gabe Ramirez, who, where you can go and find the story that's not the main story of the day. And I think that's become more and more important. That's more and more of what people are looking for in terms of campaign coverage. Jeb Bush's tax plan, for example, did not get covered the way it would have in a different cycle when it might have been the big event of the day. Instead, the attention is splintered in so many different directions that people are just really looking for what's most interesting. And I think that's a good thing for the news industry.
Right. Have we pulled all-nighters, the two
Oh,
of you?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Many times.
More than fair to count, especially with launching a new team. I came on board at Mashable in August, and my 4th day was the first GOP debate. So it was just a very long, exhausting day I live in Baltimore, and our offices, of course, are in New York. So coming into New York 2 days beforehand, figuring out how to strategize to cover a debate, and then actually doing it. I remember just getting in a cab at 2 o'clock in the morning being like, okay, well, here we are, and now I have too much adrenaline, and I am just still awake.
That's the hardest thing, I think, is coming down from everyone here has done all-nighters, but coming down from that high.
And we did touch on this, but obviously with social media, everything's immediate, everything's really fast. There's this pressure almost to keep reporting. There's tweets, we have to react to it. I got off a plane, Donald Trump tweeted this, oh my God. So tell me, and you talked about this a little bit, how have the interactions between the campaigns through social and digital changed now that we're in this very digital campaign?
I feel like I get responses a lot quicker from the people I need to talk to in campaigns if I tweet at them than if I shoot them an email or if I call them. There was a particular campaign that I was having trouble getting in contact with, and got a little frustrated, and I fired off a tweet to the press secretary, and that did a lot better than the 6 emails or phone calls I fired off. And so I think that like they're watching all of us and watching our movements, as Maeve noted, and watching what we're saying. And so I think it's changed the ability to get smart quick. And I think they realize social helps as a barometer for them to realize when they have to start responding to something, or what they can just dismiss as an irritating storyline that doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Right, exactly. Like as the storylines are blowing up, certainly you get more phone calls, people trying to manage, what you're saying and what you're tweeting and who you're retweeting. It's kind of amazing to me that they have people at each of the presidential campaigns. They have enough people to be watching all these different reporters who are out on the road and policing what they say.
Especially this early. I mean, obviously some campaigns are much better organized and much better funded than others, but the fact that we're now in September of 2015, and the candidates have that many eyes on what we're saying if we go on network news and we're doing a TV hit, or what we're tweeting, or what we're writing to call. I had someone call me and ask me if I could tweet a clarification to something that I said on air maybe a month and a half ago, and it's just like, who has that much time?
Right. And so in that respect, campaigns have really changed too in how they communicate and use social media. Right. So,
and the ones that haven't, aren't doing as well.
Right. Well, anecdotally, when you talk to Ben Carson's campaign, one of their most proud achievements is that Facebook page that they have developed, and they do animals every Friday or something, and it's something, one, they're very proud of, and two, like a legitimate part of their strategy, which probably wouldn't have happened in 2012 or 2008.
Right, and I've noticed Hillary Clinton showing up in my Instagram feed in all kinds of unexpected places, which is smart, like Refinery 29 or like fashion sites. All of a sudden it will be, a 5-second clip of her, and so she's everywhere.
Right. So as a reporter, how are you getting your stories out? What are your new strategies given the social space?
Great question. I think for me, at least with what we're doing at Mashable, we always want to be telling the story that is smart and interesting and surprising to our readers, and that isn't a story that you're going to find in the AP or the New York Times or the Washington Post. So I think that's how we look at winning this election, is by telling things that are smart, surprising, sophisticated. We're pushing them out on Twitter. We're on Twitter at Mash Politics through our Mashable News account. We have Snapchat at our disposal and Vines. We're really just trying to play on every platform and to be really visual and innovative and creative with what we do. Because I think that you really have to, especially in a storyline like this one, that you have a very expansive GOP field, you have very tough candidates on the Democratic side, and you have so many news organizations who want a piece of the pie that, at least for my money, I want us to invest in things that are smart and surprising and be relentless at pushing them out on social. And we have a phenomenal team that does that at Mashable, that really just owns that on a day-to-day basis. And I think that the proof is already there just in the month and a half that I've been there, and we've been really ramping up our political coverage, that we have the ability to do that.
Yeah, that was sort of the most fascinating thing to me coming to CNN. I mean, you have this website that's getting millions and millions of hits, and there is a really amazing team, figuring out how to get that content out to people. Our Snapchat partnership has been really great and actually surprisingly adaptable for CNN stories, because we do so many things that are still, digital first, but TV quality, high quality video. And I mean, you know that world much better than I do. For example, the Instagram partnership at the debates.
How CNN, Maeve is one of our all-star reporters, and what we've done with Maeve is create digital series that we'll talk about in a bit that are all digital first, but specifically for the CNN debate, we're a part of Snapchat Discovery, as is Mashable, and we dedicated a full edition to our debate coverage so that people in that platform, while they might not tune into TV and watch the debate, we can give them full coverage on their mobile phone from Snapchat. And the same goes for Instagram. We had a really lovely partnership with them where we took the famous Vanity Fair photographer Nigel Perry. We did these beautiful moving portraits on our CNN account of each candidate. And that was really nice to see, something a little different. Again, using all of the social media platforms to cover the
And the
full
candidates
breadth.
know how important it is.
Right.
So we had some behind the scenes. We had some candidates that weren't sure if they wanted to do the portraits, and then
Right.
as soon as they saw them and that the other candidates were doing it, it was
Right.
like, oh, don't shut that down before I get there.
Right, and Mashable's very similar.
Yeah,
in
we've
how-
also tried to be very similar and agile and playing across all those platforms and making sure that we're in that space. I mean, before the first debate, we did a Periscope preview,
Right.
as well as in Facebook mentions of me interviewing Dan Rather, who is doing some work for us, talking about the debates and having somebody with that level of experience actually sitting down and being in Facebook mentions in the feed, in Pete Cashmore's feed of being on Periscope was just
Right.
really wonderful. This also, I feel like I have to point out, while we've done really amazing work, I think this is why you're seeing IJ Review do so well too.
Right.
If they've really tapped into something powerful when it comes to social. If
Right.
you've seen the Vines they're doing, the video series that they're doing with Ted Cruz and Carly Fiorina, with Lindsey Graham smashing his phone.
That was brilliant.
It was
Totally.
brilliant. And the funny thing is, I did a media story on them and kind of their rise in their politics. And they told me that essentially they made that phone call and within 2 hours had Lindsey Graham on lock to do that phone smashing video. And the fact that you have people in all of our organizations and in that organization who are thinking that quickly of how can we creatively respond to news, how can we creatively engage in the news cycle, I think just truly shows how far you've come and how much room there is to grow. I don't think in 2012 we would have been thinking we'd see a video of a 60-something-year-old senator smashing his phone and it making that big of a splash, and it's just really wonderful to watch.
And I think that, that's an example of how candidates can use digital to get the better of another candidate. I mean, so Trump
Right.
gets up there and, lists off Lindsey Graham's cell phone number, but, Lindsey Graham finds a humorous way to deal
Right.
with it, which, didn't perhaps show up in the polls for him, but did get him more mention and attention than
It's
he
the
would
most
have.
we talked about Lindsey Graham probably this entire presidential cycle.
It's true.
I mean, that's true. But to piggyback on that, do you think with Ted Cruz doing the Simpsons impersonations with BuzzFeed, Lindsey Graham smashing his phone, Carly Fiorina doing the BuzzFeed video, Rand Paul using the chainsaw, do you think that there is Hillary Clinton doing Snapchat, do you think there's an added pressure now on campaigns to be outrageous or to do something, that they wouldn't normally do to get attention in the
do.
digital
I think there
space?
absolutely is, and I think it's partially because of the environment that we live in, but partially because, particularly if you're talking about Republicans, and I think this actually carries over to Democrats too, there are just so many of them.
Right.
There is an added pressure to stand out no matter what the environment looks like, and with so many of, obviously with Donald Trump as far ahead as a front runner in so many polls, but the rest of them are all pretty close together. There's added pressure to stand out no matter what.
Right. And speaking of, candidates doing these new forms of communication, do you ever feel like because of social media that candidates are able to go around you and just
yeah.
go directly to the public? And is that frustrating for you? What's that like as a reporter?
I think that often they try to do that, and certainly, the Obama campaign really used social media in that way to speak directly to their supporters and did that very successfully. But I think that the news environment that we're in right now, there's so much interaction that it's impossible for them to get their message out unfiltered. Right. And it'll be really interesting in this campaign to measure the effects of ads, the traditional ads that people see in their living rooms, because I don't know, that still is where all the money is going to be in campaigns, at least so far, but we don't really know what the impact is in this new world, especially with the dark money.
Absolutely. I feel like the cycle of, we saw this back with Sarah Palin as well. Candidates are very good about trying to circumvent the media to what effect. I think what we are seeing that's been fascinating to me, at least in this cycle, is the candidates that are going to non-traditional media, like you mentioned with Hillary Clinton and Refinery 29 and now Lena Dunham. You've seen Bernie Sanders sit down and do a soul food sit down with Larry Wilmore. The late night
Right.
circuit has been absolutely phenomenal already this cycle early on with candidates trying to go there and make a splash. So I think the selection of outlets, especially with the candidates that are perhaps not always as friendly to the press, has been really interesting to watch.
And just a couple of cycles ago, people were talking about whether that was like presidential for,
Right.
Obama to do, for President Obama to do the late night circuit. So all of that has
Right.
completely changed in a good way.
Totally. especially with Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. Okay, so with all of that, are you taking advantage of all of the tools, and what are you taking advantage of in your reporting? You know, what are you doing on social that would be different from 2008 or 2012?
Well, my favorite thing on the campaign trail actually was, which I started in 2012, was the campaign fashion report, which which was just, there were a lot of sort of down moments, and the best part of covering a campaign is sort of wandering through the crowd and talking to people, and in each place that you're in, you would see so many different trends, and people would show up in their costumes, and it sort of was a way to bring the voters, you know, who the voters are, out in a way on Instagram. And we're hoping to do a lot more with that at CNN this cycle in a more formalized way, you know, and use our traffic to use that to talk to real people and get their stories out.
Right.
We're very much in the same position. I think one of the things that we're constantly talking about in our editorial meetings when we talk about politics and how we want to cover it and how we want to be distinctive is that people want to know what a Donald Trump supporter looks like and what that person believes in. People want to know what they look like. So I think one of the best examples of how we're letting people kind of have their own voices and showing up is that recently we went out to the anti-Iran deal rally at the Capitol, and one of our reporters, Megan Specia, took around a whiteboard and had people write down why they were there, and we took their photos, we put them out on social, and then we put them in a post and put them on our website, because I can write you 1,000 words about the Iran deal. I've covered it from top to bottom when I used to cover Congress. Nobody really cares about that, and they can get that story literally anywhere else, but you can't replace a person sitting there telling you in their own words and seeing their faces and hearing their stories, and especially for the type of audience that we have at Mashable, I think that's what's really craved and that we need an injection of in this news cycle.
Right.
What are some examples, too, of what we're doing in that regard? For, like, I know there's been such a focus on bringing more real voters into the conversation, because often, you know, that gets lost.
Yeah. Well, you do Maeve West, which is a digital series that Maeve hosts, which is something in 2012 news organizations hadn't yet embraced, a digital first series that only lives in digital for social. And I think we have an example of what Maeve West looks like, and sort of something that you touched on, which is, you know, sure, we cover campaigns and we cover social and campaigns, but also what's on the periphery, and what is it about these candidates, and
what's the conversation that's actually going on out there.
And this is an example, and Juana will have her examples as well, but this is one of the stories that Maeve was able to sort of get ahead of before other news organizations started covering this.
This was right when Trump announced, and it was the first Maeve West that we did.
Right, and it was about the piñata phenomenon, which later ended up being a social media trend. So I think we're going to play one right now. If it works.
There are two things Donald Trump probably doesn't know about LA. It has a piñata district, and right now, he's its biggest star. Your top seller right now is Donald Trump piñatas. When the owner of Amazing Piñatas, Lorena Robleto, read Donald Trump's incendiary claims about undocumented immigrants, she took matters into her own hands. So that night after you read Trump's comments, you decided to make a piñata.
Yes. I was actually frustrated. It was been a long day, so I just started playing with the idea, and I started molding his face. I felt like, well, why would he making such a remarks when knowingly that there's so many great people in California and the United States who are Latinos and are contributing big time to the economy of this country, even if they're undocumented.
Though Trump was talking about Mexican immigrants, Robleto says he's galvanized all Latinos, whether they are citizens like her or the many who live in the shadows.
I take it personal, I'm Nicaraguan, but this time it hit home.
Outside a recent Trump event in LA, protesters said his rhetoric is damaging, not only hurtful to them.
He's a problem for the Republican Party.
Why?
He is creating a lot of division. He's hurting what the Republican Party is trying to do, reach out to immigrants and Hispanics. He's out of control.
If you just had a quick minute with him to ask him a question, what would you ask him?
Like, this is not the right way to do this. There is other ways. We don't care about the political party, but we want to be respected.
Respect. It's a simple word, but an important one to Latinos like Robledo, who describes herself as independent. Just the kind of voter the GOP must win over to take back the White House.
Why do you think people who come here are buying these piñatas of Donald Trump?
Some of them said, no, I'm just going to bid and get the frustration out of it. Some of them, it's a piece of conversation for a party. Or some of them, they think it's funny, because at the end it's trash. They trash him.
Trump says he'll win the Latino vote by creating jobs. Whether that's true or not, he's been good business for piñata makers.
So that's an example of something we wouldn't have, something we wouldn't have invested in or probably done in 2012. And I don't know if you want to speak to that experience a little for you as a digital reporter.
Yeah, it's been a really fun thing to think about storytelling on the campaign trail, in a completely different way. And the most fun part of campaigns is what goes on behind the scenes, and I think that's what we're trying to bring to people this cycle, and CNN has the resources to be able to do that.
Right, and then you have some stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I'm in an interesting position because my job in 2012 and my job right now covering the election could not be more different than night and day.
Right.
While Politico is always going to be a leader in the political space, it's mostly targeting the people who are in the business of politics, who are inside the Beltway. And Mashable is worlds apart, and that's what makes it so much fun, is that we get to talk to people both in this country and outside the country who are curious and smart and part of the digital and connected generation. And we've done some examples of work, I think, that's really highlighted that, and we've done a lot of serious, hard-hitting journalism already this cycle in collaboration with US and World team, our business editor, our science team, all across the newsroom. We're all really trying to take part in the story. We've also tried to have a little bit of fun with it, too, so I think we have a couple of still examples of our stuff as well. So this is what I mentioned this earlier. Dan Rather actually has been doing a little work for us at Mashable. He actually just wrote a really great piece that came out this week on Republicans in science. But he actually came to the newsroom for our first debate and hung out with us and kind of shared his impressions of what we saw. And along with the debate, I sat down with him and interviewed him in one of the offices in our HQ. And he kind of talked to us about what he was seeing and he was doing. And people were really excited about it, even though I kind of wondered when we decided to do this, it's Dan Rather, people actually don't know who he was, but there were so many questions that came in across Periscope of people who wanted to know what he was thinking about the candidates and what he felt. Up here now is our live blog from the second Republican debate hosted by CNN, and this shows you some of the...
This was the landing page that you guys had?
Yeah, this is the landing page, so we were constantly feeding this up at the top. This is what we kind of have still, this is what it is now that it's living. But we really wanted a clean, sleek interface. One of the things that I know that a lot of our team and I feel about live blogs is often they're really cluttered, they're not really usable, it's hard to stream through them, there are just too many assets. So we really wanted a clean interface that you could use in the moment as well if you were not sitting at home watching the debate, as well as something that you could look at later. So we ended up changing it, adding a dynamic image at the top, and then putting some of our highlights from the stories that we liked the best so that people can still draw back to that and look, and I think it's something we'll absolutely carry forward in future debates.
Great.
This last one is our class of 2016 superlatives. One of the things that we picked up on is that a lot of people in our audience, which isn't necessarily your hardcore political audience, just thought it was really wacky. There were so darn many candidates, and we wanted to do something fun to play off of that. How can we showcase that? So created this. It looks like a retro yearbook page. So you have your high school superlatives, and it was just a fun kickback and something that did really well for us, but it's something I could have never done in my last job, and I don't think that we could have done in a previous media environment, certainly.
Which is quite funny. Great minds must think alike, because we had superlative bingo during our last debate on social. So That's really cool. It's great.
It's like the evolution of like the
Right.
drinking game, right? In debates,
Which
it
I
used
should
to be a drinking game.
Right. Dan Rather actually also wrote us a drinking game for the first debate.
I would love
I did not play it with him, but I should have.
the vision of Dan Rather in Mashable's office, sitting with all of you, working on debate coverage, just makes me giggle inside.
It was really fun. He was front and center in the middle of the couch with his drink as we were all kind of figuring out what we wanted to get on the
With
web
his drink?
next. Yeah,
What's his drink of choice?
He had a drink. I believe he had what, wild turkey, was it? Wild turkey, Amanda says. So.
Was he wearing a T-shirt while he?
No.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
Dan
So
Rather
he
in
wasn't-
t-shirt.
Always
No,
in a
business
suit.
suit always. But I think he had a lot of fun too, and it was cool for us to have him there, and especially for me as a political junkie, somebody whose coverage I'd admired and who I think is super sharp. It was a lot of fun and just a perfect blend, I think, of old media meets new media.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, we've talked about all these tools. We've talked about how our coverage is different and all of the innovative, creative things that we're both doing in our organizations. Do you, as a reporter, you're out there and your goal is to put out a really crisp story that's well reported. Do you feel pressures to be Snapchatting at the same time and to be Instagramming at the same time and to be tweeting and live tweeting? I mean, how do you manage that?
I think that pressure is definitely there, and it just sort of adds a different dimension to the day. That was also certainly true at the LA Times too. Reporters in print outlets and TV outlets. I mean, everyone has just sort of added all of these different ways of reporting and different dimensions to their job. But I mean, it also, during a campaign event, Twitter actually can be kind of helpful because if you're sitting there covering the campaign event and watching how people are responding to it, it does also shape the story. So there are pressures, but also upsides to that as well. And sometimes, when I'm writing like an analysis piece, I just have to shut it all off.
Right.
And just be back like with my laptop and, typewriter style.
Right. Do you feel that way too?
I think for us particularly, if we're out in the field covering a campaign event or out covering a debate or what have you, it's crucial for us to play in all of those spaces. So yes, there's pressure, but it's also hugely important because we know where our audience is at. We know that we have a strong following on social that is hungry and expects us to be there in that moment. We know that we have a strong following that expects us to be tweeting, to be Snapchatting, to be periscoping and all of that. So we want to take advantage of all of those outlets. And yes, it's a lot of pressure, but it's also a lot of fun because I know Mashable is one of the first places where I've actually taken a lot more, and maybe it's just because my role is so different now that I'm directing coverage. I take a lot of time actually reading what comes in as we're engaging in these live events, whether it's tweets or comments on Facebook or what have you. And I think that engagement actually makes my coverage a lot smarter. Now, of course, that does make it very difficult. Like Maeve said, if I want to sit down and do an analysis piece, I know that when I worked on a big piece kind of setting up Carly Fiorina for the debate that you guys hosted. And it put me in a position of having to say no to a lot of other things, which is often very difficult. And I think that might be the hardest thing about this cycle is that there's always something else that you could be doing that short, quick take on. There's always something else that I could be tweeting. There's always something else that I could be vining. You just have to pick and choose your hits and decide what works for you and what works for your organization.
Especially with, 16, 17 candidates on the Republican side. Like, that's just a whole new ball game.
Right. So before we get to questions, we've talked a lot about creative storytelling, but what are some other must-reads for you guys in creative storytelling methods? What are some things that you've seen pop that you would recommend or that you like?
I love some of the things that our team is doing. That really, I have so many friends, especially in LA, who don't care about politics at all, or don't cover it in the same way that people in DC do, don't follow it. And I think our team has done such a brilliant job of, with Donald Trump's announcement speech, doing a 60-minute version of it, and you pretty much got the gist without having to actually
watch the
without actually having to watch it. And I think that's important because people don't have time, or we did. The State of the Union, 67 State of the Unions in 67 seconds, showing how little has changed over time. And that's, one of the ways that you can cover politics now in a way that's different and interesting, or Too Many Cooks. I don't, how did that all come about? The
Too Many Cooks video,
which did really well.
Right. Started, I wish we could, well, no, I don't wish we could show you. I wish we could, but we don't have it. It was just, it's a little odd. It was a parody on the actual Too Many Cooks video, and that started as like just a joke.
In the office,
Right. And then it was like, okay, well, maybe we should do it. And then it evolved into an actual video, which at first we didn't really put on CNN.com, actually. We let it live in YouTube and on social only to see what the response was. And then it became
Took off.
Then it became a thing, and that was very different for CNN.
Especially for like a legacy news organization to be thinking about things like that.
But and that's why Mashable is doing the superlatives, and that's why you're putting out GIF, or whatever you guys want to call it, again and again and again on pages. It's about bringing in a new audience that wouldn't normally be engaged in politics. And so, what about you? What's your creative storytelling sort of thing you like?
I mean, I still think that for me, IJ Review has just impressed me so much just from what they've done in terms of viral video and just being able to, I admire their ability to take advantage of sharp, creative, fast moments as quickly as they do. I think that one of the biggest hallmarks of being a successful news organization and political operation right now is your ability to be agile and to move quickly. And I think that if anyone is truly doing that this cycle, it's them. I can't, fun secret, I really rarely ever watch online video because it drives me insane, and I'm impatient as all heck. And their videos make me stop and they make me laugh, and that's a good hallmark because above all else, I think that covering politics and engaging in the cycle should be fun, and we should take advantage of that. And that's something I think you're going to see us. I don't want to give too much away, but we're rolling out a lot of really cool stuff at Mashable soon that I think will excite people and that will make them have fun in the cycle. And why shouldn't you? I mean, look at what we've got to cover, and guys, we've still got 15 months of this.
Well, and I mean, so much of politics, so many friends that I've had don't understand why I like it so much, why it becomes your lifeblood. But so much of it is just theater. And, I think that now that we have all these new ways to cover the campaign, you can show that to a much greater extent.
Right. I think we are going to do a little Q&A.
Any questions?
Let's do it.
Or
I think there's a microphone.
Oh, wow, there's a lot of them. You first. Yeah, sure.
So, all right. How do you, when you go to a campaign event and you have the day-to-day and you're out there with several other news outlets, how do you make the content of your coverage kind of stand out and kind of go deeper into the story? What do you look for in that sense? Does that make sense?
In terms of your campaign events, your average, how you cover a campaign event in a way that's
How do you cover a campaign
different.
event where it's often somewhat repetitive and there's several outlets there? How do you make your coverage stand out?
Yeah, I think that, I think Juana and I both have had this experience that often, the story is what's not what's happening on stage. It's the people that you're talking to in the crowd over and over again. Often reporting about the Democrats in 2008, for example, it's interesting, once you have 20 or 40 conversations with voters, you often start to hear themes, and that's really what you're looking for in campaign coverage, is what's sort of the storyline that's emerging in how people are responding to a candidate. Whether with Hillary Clinton it was that she was, too unapproachable, or, Barack Obama, the experience question. So I think just really listening for those cues and finding what the deeper thread is the way that you make your coverage stand out.
I mean, I think my biggest tips would be to not worry about what the person next to you is typing on their laptop during the speech, to get up and go out and engage with people and to talk to them and see what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And I'm also always, I know it's a very, very old and overused thing, but I'm always looking for the moments of what would I go home and tell my parents? What would I go home and tell my boyfriend? What are those interesting moments? What made me laugh or what made me roll my eyes? Just finding the things that are maybe a little bit off the beaten path but can still be exciting. I think that there's this tendency to think that every political story must be very buttoned up and very serious, and I think some of my favorite things that I have created both this cycle and in the past cycle have had quite a bit of levity to them and quite a lot of fun to them.
And also taking the time to just go a lot deeper. I'm dying to read the story about Trump's years at military school. I mean, sometimes you have to take the time away from the trail to do the stories that really tell you something about the person that is the candidate, and that's what people really care about. That's why they vote.
I think my favorite story that I did early on the cycle when I was still at NPR is before Lindsey Graham announced for president, I spent 3 days in his hometown and talked to the people who knew him and the guy who owned the house that Lindsey Graham grew up in after he moved out of a trailer that's actually the house that his parents died in. And I think I learned more about Lindsey Graham, who I'd covered on Congress actually for 4 years, I guess, by spending 3 days in his hometown when there were no other reporters around than I did if I had actually stuck around and gone to his announcement speech. So go where other people aren't going and look for creative stories. And I think there's also this need sometimes among editors that every single campaign rally has to be a story. Sometimes it's
not a story.
You here had a question? And can you say when you ask what your name is and where you're from?
My name is Emmanuel Tree. I'm from C-SPAN, so it's nice
Hi.
to see you again.
Good to see you too.
3 parts to the question. You talked about accuracy of the people who tweet. I'm just wondering if you could speak both to your organizations, how they police the tweeters, because they're not often the ones writing the stories for the organizations, but they're pushing your information or your stories out. The other part is Facebook for Carson and Twitter for Trump, what that says about the people who are following them and about the candidates and the kind of people they're going after in terms of the voter. And for you, Juana, in terms of your experience at Politico and NPR, what you're leaving behind to take and what you're taking to Mashable from those experiences as a reporter.
So you're up.
All right. I've been really lucky to so far work for, I'll include C-SPAN in this, 4 really, really great organizations that all approach politics very differently based on the audiences that they serve. And I don't regret a moment I spent working for any of them. Politico was my first job in DC, and it made me an incredibly aggressive, tenacious, well-sourced reporter. I also had one of the best editors of my life there in Charlie Matassian, who I also worked for at NPR, and it was a heck of a lot of fun and a lot of work. I never would have thought in one of my first journalism jobs I would be sitting next to Maeve on the Romney plane. So it was a lot of fun. In terms of NPR, I think I had worked in public radio in college. I got to learn a lot about how to add voice and texture and to create what NPR calls those driveway moments, the intimacy and personality in stories. And I think that the merger of those 2 things is really what I'm hoping to infuse our political coverage with at Mashable. I hope that if I were to have this conversation with you in a postmortem at the end of 2016, that we have created something that is smart and sophisticated and surprising and fun, and that speaks to people where they're at, which most of the time isn't going to be accessing our content sitting at their desks at a computer. It's going to be using the devices that are in their hand that we're all on constantly when they're on the go or picking up their kids from work and what have you. I want to make sure we meet our audiences where we're at, that we teach them something new, that we make them laugh or smile or roll their eyes, and that above all else, we excite them about being engaged in their democracy, because as dorky as that and Schoolhouse Rock sounding as that is, it's something that's really important to me, and it's why I started doing this and do all the all-nighters and things like that. So I hope that all of that happens, and you should ask me about that and hold me to it in a couple of years, and we'll see if I did my job well or not.
That was super impressive. And the other 2 pieces of that.
Donald Trump and Ben Carson and what it says about their followers was the second piece. And the first piece was about accuracy and the tweeters. Gotcha.
Right.
I think that's a little bit different for us, though, because a lot of the times if we're the person at the rally, and we're tweeting, and then we are going back and writing the story.
Yeah, and you know, we have a very rigorous team of fact checkers, and they're very fast in terms of, I actually haven't run into a situation like that, but they are watching very carefully the people who are working for CNN, what they're tweeting, and there's very strict, guidelines about that in terms of
As the tweeter.
as the tweeter.
And we have the CNN Politics social team is in the audience as well. So CNN has a social team, and CNN Politics, because we are so dedicated to this coverage of the election, has their own social team. And I would say from the CNN perspective, since I run the flagship accounts, our focus is, the writer will always know the story the best and will always know the nuances the best. And so what we try and do is create a process where a writer will help us identify the nuggets, because we don't have time to read every single story and every single piece of content. And as a lot of you know, framing content for social is very different than, say, writing a headline or playing to SEO. It's how to make that content speak to each native audience. And so we ask our writers, and CNN Politics does this a lot too, to help us amplify their content by identifying the juicy little nuggets within their stories, or why are you so passionate about this piece of content? And so there's a process where when they share their story with us, they do give us a few nuggets that we can work with, maybe some suggested language, et cetera, et cetera. And then beyond that, the CNN Politics team, because we are, and I don't necessarily want to speak for them because we work together, but it's a different team. But I know that they're very invested in the content that all of the reporters and producers are putting out. And because the team works together so closely, they're very aware of the nuances and what's ticking on social and how to play to a trend, because we do use a variety of platforms that help us identify where the conversations are, where the heat of the conversation is, where to target, how to play to the, what so-and-so is saying and how it's starting to trend or pre-trends, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that there is a very fluid relationship and a close one with reporters into social.
And I also think that if there are, factual inaccuracies, either something that's being tweeted or, something in a story that's wrong, Twitter is a very interactive place where that will get pointed out immediately. I remember, a misspelling once in one of my stories of the LA Times that just took off, and thousands of people flagging it, and not thousands, hundreds, I guess.
It's enough, though.
But we immediately corrected it, and I put out a correction on Twitter to recognize the conversation.
And I would say in that regard, transparency on social is always paramount and always key. So. Yeah.
Oh, I think to Juana's point, I think that what's so fascinating is that we don't really know which voters are going to turn out this year, but both of those candidates have clearly brought in a lot of people into politics who were not part of the conversation before, and it'll be really interesting to see, the extent to which they drive caucus season and the first primaries.
Right, and I think, Donald Trump, obviously, and Carly Fiorina, they both have a high percentage of conversation evolving around them on Twitter. And for Donald Trump, he has said some provocative and divisive things that drive that audience to talk about those issues. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why
the audience on both sides responding to him.
He's so, the conversation around him is so much larger than, say, other candidates, in addition to him being a very active and conversational tweeter. And for Ben Carson, just having spoken with the campaign, they actually didn't foresee that success on Facebook happening the way that it did, but they are so happy it happened. And so, others are bigger, Kasich, he's obsessed with Snapchat. And, if you follow him on Snapchat, you'll see that that's his thing. So I think campaigns have also sort of found where their niche and successes are too.
And it doesn't work for other people.
Right.
Some of the other candidates are like, maybe not your medium.
Maybe Snapchat's not your thing, but thanks for trying. Yep.
Oh, it's, I think they just rebranded to International Journal, actually, and I think I called them IJ Review by accident, so sorry about that.
Oh, did they? Interesting.
Hi, I'm Fergus Bell. I'm a UGC consultant. I'm former social media and UGC editor for the AP. You might be able to tell that I'm British. When I used to do a lot of stuff for the monitoring of social for the elections at AP, but I'm just wondering, like, outside of the US, everyone pays a lot of attention to the way that the US elections are covered. So much so that now in the UK, we fortunately or unfortunately have debates. I just wondered, like, if you take any kind of lessons or inspiration from other elections going on around the world in terms of the innovation in reporting there, or if it's something that you've thought about generally.
I think it's, I mean, I wish that we had shorter election cycles. In some ways, I feel like, you know, the vetting of the candidates is really different. So it's fascinating to watch, you know, your election cycles from that perspective. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we'll be watching a lot more going forward.
I think also at Mashable particularly, we're very mindful of the global mindset because we do have so many people who are watching our site and coming to our site and to our content from international audiences. So you'll often see it. And we have staffers who are across the world. We recently launched Mashable Asia. We have great staff in London. We've had people in the Ukraine. We have a lot of really strong staffers from other parts of the world. So that's always going to be something that's really, really, really at the core for us.
And you can speak to our international audience a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the CNN international audience is also an expat audience. So we find, and in addition, obviously being a vast international audience, but there's 1,000% interest in this election across those audiences, which we've seen, which has been, you know, it's really great to see, I think. Yeah. But I think
thank you so much for coming.
Thank you guys.
Up for time, but please, you know, follow us on Twitter, Mash Politics, Mashable, CNN Politics @CNN, and follow these lovely ladies.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank y'all so much.
And yeah.